there is a man whose name most Christians have never heard, and yet, without him, some of the most important details surrounding the world of Jesus might have been lost forever. He was not a disciple. He was not a prophet. In fact, for most of his life, the people who trusted him most believed he had betrayed them completely. He was called a coward, a sellout, a traitor, to his own people, to his own God, to everything he was supposed to stand for. And yet, something extraordinary happened through this man's life. Something that even he could not have fully understood in the moment. Something that, when you look back at it now, feels almost too precise to be accidental. His name was Josephus, and if you have never heard his story, then what you are about to discover is going to stay with you for a very long time. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something sincerely. If you have never subscribed to this channel, would you do it right now? Not for me, but because stories like this one, stories that connect the hidden corners of history to your living, breathing faith, these are exactly the kinds of things the enemy does not want you to understand. Every time you subscribe, every time you stay, you are saying that truth matters to you, and that matters more than you know. So take just a second, subscribe, and then let us go on this journey together. Now let us go back, all the way back, to a world on the edge of collapse. Imagine the year is somewhere around 37 in the Common Era, and the land of Israel is a powder keg. The Romans have been occupying Jewish territory for decades. The people are restless, and the tension between the proud, ancient Jewish identity and the crushing weight of Roman imperial rule has been building for generations. Prophets are rising, rebels are forming in the wilderness, and everywhere you look, there are men and women who believe that the moment of liberation is finally coming, that God is about to move, that the Romans will be swept away like dust, and the kingdom of Israel will be restored to its rightful glory. Into this world, a boy is born. His full name, the one he will carry into history, is Titus Flavius Josephus, but he is born as Yosef ben Matityahu, Joseph, son of Matthias. He is born in Jerusalem, into a priestly family, which means from the very beginning this child is surrounded by scripture, by tradition, by the weight of sacred history. He grows up in the temple's shadow. He is educated deeply, and he is by all accounts brilliant. By the time he is a teenager, he has already impressed the leading religious minds of his day with the sharpness of his thinking. And here is where the story starts to get interesting, because Josephus does not simply accept what he is handed. He is curious in a way that goes deeper than most people are comfortable with. As a young man, he studies under the three major Jewish sects of his time, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes, and each one of these groups had its own understanding of what it meant to be faithful to God. Each one had its own vision of the future. Josephus, this young priest's son with burning eyes and a restless mind, spends years moving between all three, trying to understand which one holds the truest path. He eventually aligns himself most closely with the Pharisees. But what is remarkable is not which group he chose. What is remarkable is that he was willing to question at all. That kind of spiritual hunger, that refusal to simply inherit a faith without examining it, is something you might recognize in yourself. And maybe it is part of what drew you to this video today. But Josephus is also deeply loyal to his people. And when the first century unfolds, and the tensions with Rome finally boil over into full, catastrophic war, Josephus does not run. He steps forward, accepts a military command in the Galilee region of northern Israel, and is tasked with defending his people against one of the most powerful military forces the ancient world has ever seen. And this is where everything begins to fall apart. The Roman army arrives in Galilee under the command of a general named Vespasian. And what Josephus encounters when he sees that army is not just a military force, it is a wall, something that even in his boldest moments he must have understood was nearly impossible to stop. His forces are outmatched, the towns fall one by one, and Josephus and his remaining soldiers are eventually driven into a cave near a place called Jotapata, surrounded with no way out. What happens next is one of the most morally complex and emotionally disturbing moments in all of ancient history. And Josephus describes it himself, years later, in painful and almost confessional detail. Trapped in that cave, his fellow soldiers decide that they will not surrender. They will not let Rome take them alive, and they propose a suicide pact, choosing to kill each other rather than fall into Roman hands. Josephus is against it. He argues with them, tells them that life is sacred, that suicide is not honorable in the eyes of God, that there is another way. But his words carry no weight in that moment, because the desperation, the fear, the pride of men who would rather die free than live as prisoners, it is too strong. And Josephus, somehow, either through clever thinking or through something that felt to him like divine intervention, ends up being the last man standing in that cave, the only survivor. He walks out. He surrenders to the Romans, and from that moment, his own people never fully trusted him again. Because to survive when everyone else died, especially in the way Josephus survived, that looks like cowardice. It looks like he chose himself over his brothers. It looks like he chose Rome over Israel. And for many Jewish people of his time, that was unforgivable. He became, in their eyes, a traitor. But now I want you to sit with something for a moment, because what happens next is not what a simple traitor's story looks like. When Josephus is brought before Vespasian, he does something that shocks everyone in the room. He delivers a prophecy. Standing before the most powerful Roman general in the region, a prisoner of war with his hands bound and his future completely uncertain, Josephus looks at Vespasian and tells him that he will one day become emperor of Rome. Think about what that takes. Vespasian is not emperor. He is a general. He is powerful, yes, but the idea that he would become emperor of the entire Roman Empire is in that moment not obvious, not certain, not even particularly likely. And yet Josephus says it, calmly, directly, as if he knows. Vespasian does not kill him. Instead, he holds him as a kind of prisoner scholar, a captive whose intelligence and strange confidence have made him interesting rather than expendable. And then, sometime later, word arrives from Rome. Vespasian has been declared emperor, just as Josephus had said. Everything changes. Vespasian's son Titus takes command of the Roman forces in Judea. Josephus is freed. He is given a new Roman family name, and he becomes Flavius Josephus, a name that carries the mark of his Roman patrons. He lives the rest of his life under Roman protection, witnesses the destruction of Jerusalem from the Roman side of the lines, watches the temple burn, and sees his people taken into captivity, scattered, broken. And he writes all of it down. That is the part of this story that I really want you to understand, because it is the part that changes everything about how we see this man. Josephus spends the second half of his life writing, and he writes in enormous detail, in a way that is structured, sourced, and remarkably careful. His major works cover the entire sweep of Jewish history, from creation all the way to the destruction of the temple in the year 70 of the Common Era. He writes about the kings and the prophets, the laws and the wars, the rise and fall of Jerusalem. And he does all of this from the vantage point of someone who was there, someone who lived it, someone who walked through the ruins. Now I want you to understand something about the world in which Josephus was writing. This was not a time of libraries and printing presses. History was fragile, stories were fragile, and the great events of the ancient world could disappear in a generation if no one wrote them down, if the ones who did write them down were killed, if the scrolls were burned, if the languages were forgotten. The destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70 was not just a military tragedy. It was a catastrophic erasure of culture, of memory, of living witnesses, and everything that was known, everything that was kept alive by priests and scholars and ordinary people in that city. So much of it simply ceased to exist, except in Josephus, because he was on the other side of the wall. He survived. He remembered. He wrote. His work, called the Jewish Antiquities, is one of the longest surviving pieces of ancient historical literature, covering 20 books worth of material. And it includes something that no other ancient secular source does with quite the same kind of detail. It includes references to the world in which Jesus of Nazareth walked. Now let me be careful here, because this is a point where I want to be honest with you. Scholars have debated for centuries exactly what Josephus wrote about Jesus, and how much of what survives today reflects his original words versus later additions by Christian scribes who copied his manuscripts. These are real, legitimate questions, and I am not going to brush past them. The honest answer is that we do not have Josephus's original manuscripts. We have copies made by others over centuries, and in some of those copies, there are passages that seem almost too positive about Jesus to have been written by a Jewish man who did not follow him. But here is what is important. Even the scholars, who are most skeptical about those additions, agree that Josephus almost certainly wrote something about Jesus, something that was then modified by later hands. And even in the most skeptical reconstructions of what his original text said, it confirms that Jesus existed as a historical figure, that he was a teacher who attracted followers, that he was condemned and crucified under Pontius Pilate, and that his followers did not disappear after his death. That last detail is remarkable when you think about it. A secular historian, writing within living memory of the events, acknowledges that the movement of Jesus continued after the crucifixion. He does not explain it away. He simply notes it as a fact that required noting. And for the faith, that matters deeply. And there is more, because Josephus also writes about John the Baptist, describing him as a righteous man who called people to virtue and who baptized those who came to him in a way that was not about ritual cleansing, but about moral transformation. That description, coming from outside the gospel accounts, lines up with extraordinary precision to what the Gospel of Mark chapter 1 and the Gospel of Luke chapter 3 tell us about John's ministry. Josephus also writes about James, the brother of Jesus, and his execution at the hands of the high priest. And this is another moment where an outside source, someone with no reason to promote the early Christian movement, confirms a detail that appears in the life of the early church. It means that when someone tells you that Jesus is just a religious legend invented by desperate people in the ancient world, you can point to a man who was not a Christian, who never called himself a follower of Jesus, who was, by the end of his life, considered a traitor by the very community Jesus himself had come from. And that man, writing in careful historical detail, confirms that Jesus walked in history, was killed under Roman authority, and left behind a community of followers that endured. That is not nothing. That is profound. And it all came through someone history marked as a traitor. I want you to stay with that contradiction for a moment, because it says something important, not just about Josephus, not just about history, but about the way God moves through the world. Because if you read the Bible carefully, you will notice something over and over again. God does not always choose the obvious person. He does not always use the one who looks the most righteous, the most prepared, the most respectable in the eyes of the community around them. He used a man named Moses who had fled Egypt in disgrace and spent 40 years hiding in the desert before God called him back. He used a woman named Rahab, who is named in the very lineage of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 1. He used a king named David, whose path back to faithfulness was long and painful. He used a man named Paul, who had spent his early life persecuting the very church he would later give his life to build. The pattern is consistent because God reaches into the complicated, the broken, the morally ambiguous, the misunderstood, and draws out something that serves a purpose far beyond what anyone could have predicted. Josephus is part of that pattern. Now, I am not saying God whispered into Josephus's ear and gave him a deliberate mission to preserve history for future Christians. What I am saying is something more mysterious than that. God moves through history in ways that do not always announce themselves clearly, and sometimes the preservation of truth happens through instruments that would surprise us, and sometimes the person who looks like a failure in the short story turns out to be essential in the long one. Josephus believed he had survived for a reason. He said so. He described his survival in the cave not as luck or cowardice, but as divine appointment. He said he felt, in that moment, that God was calling him to live, that there was something he was supposed to witness and record. Whether he understood the full scope of what that meant, we cannot know. But when we look back at what his writings preserved, it is hard not to feel the weight of that conviction. Let me take you a little deeper into the world Josephus wrote about, because the context he provides for the first century is something that no Sunday school class ever quite captures in full. Reading Josephus is like walking through the streets of Jerusalem in the time of Jesus, with all the politics, the fear, the tension, the religious debates. And when you read the Gospels alongside his historical writings, things that felt abstract suddenly become vivid. The temple, for instance. Jesus speaks about the temple repeatedly. He walks through it. He overturns tables in it. He weeps over Jerusalem because he knows what is coming for it. In the Gospel of Luke chapter 19, he says with devastating sadness that the days will come when not one stone shall be left upon another. And Josephus was there when those stones fell. He watched the temple burn. He described the fire consuming the gold so that it melted and ran between the stones, which later caused the Roman soldiers to pry apart every stone to extract it, which means, in a horrible and precise way, that the destruction Jesus predicted came true exactly as he described it. And Josephus was the eyewitness who recorded it without ever realizing he was fulfilling a prophecy. That should give you chills, and it should make you look at the Gospels differently, because the words of Jesus were not spoken into a vacuum. They were spoken into a real, breathing, documented world, a world that Josephus walked through, a world he recorded with the care of someone who knew that memory, once lost, does not come back. There is something else about Josephus that does not get discussed often enough, and that is his inner life. When you read his writings carefully, you sense a man who is deeply conflicted, not about his loyalty to the Jewish people, which he maintains throughout his life with genuine passion, but about what it means to live in a world where everything he loved has been destroyed. He watched Jerusalem fall. He watched the temple burn. He watched his people scattered, and he spent the rest of his life writing about all of it from a position of relative safety in Rome, under the protection of the very empire that had done the destroying. That is a painful place to exist, and there is something in that pain that makes his writing more honest, not less. He is not trying to make anyone look perfect. He records failures alongside triumphs, and that kind of honesty, that willingness to tell the complicated truth, even when it is uncomfortable, is part of what makes his work so historically valuable. There is a passage in the Psalms where the writer describes sitting by the rivers of Babylon and weeping because they cannot sing the Lord's song in a foreign land. And there is something in that image that reaches across the centuries and touches the life of Josephus with an almost unbearable precision. He too sat in a foreign land. He too lived under the shadow of the empire that had destroyed everything sacred. He too kept writing, kept remembering, because that was the only act of faithfulness left to him. And the song he sang preserved the memory of the world in which God walked among us. Now, let us speak plainly about why this matters for your faith today, not just as history, but right now, in the life you are actually living. We live in a world where people demand clean heroes and simple stories, where anyone who has survived through morally complicated circumstances is immediately suspect, where we are quick to call people traitors and slow to sit with the complexity of what it means to live through something terrible and come out the other side changed. But the Bible does not teach us that clean heroes are the only valid ones. It teaches us that God is sovereign over history in ways we cannot always see in the moment, and that truth has a way of surviving, not because the people carrying it were perfect, but because the God who commissioned the truth is faithful beyond what any human failure can undo. The preservation of history connected to the life of Jesus did not depend solely on the perfectly faithful. It was secured through the dedicated disciples, yes, through the apostles who gave their lives, but also through a first-century Jewish historian who surrendered to Rome and spent his life in the shadow of accusation, and who nevertheless picked up his pen day after day and wrote down everything he had seen. That should give you a kind of hope that is harder to shake than the more comfortable kind, because if the truth of Jesus' existence in history had to be protected only by the perfectly faithful, it might feel fragile, but it was also protected, unexpectedly, by a complicated man in Rome with a Roman name and a broken heart. And that means the truth is more robust than we sometimes fear. It finds ways to survive that we would never have planned for ourselves. Josephus died without knowing that his writings would become one of the most important pieces of external evidence for the historical reality of Jesus, without knowing that the very act of sitting down each day and recording what he had witnessed would echo forward across 2,000 years and land in the hands of believers who desperately needed it. He died without knowing that Christian scholars would spend centuries poring over his words and ultimately finding in him a reluctant but undeniable witness to the world of the New Testament. He died without knowing that someone like you would hear his name spoken with something like gratitude 2,000 years after his birth. He could not have known. He just wrote. He just showed up, day after day, with his memory and his grief and his enormous, disciplined mind, and he wrote down everything he could remember about the world he came from. That was all he could do, and it turned out to be exactly enough. That is a lesson worth holding close, because most of us live most of our lives without being able to see what our faithfulness is actually building. We plant seeds we may never see grow. We preserve things through our choices and our words and our love that will only make sense to someone else long after we are gone, and that can feel invisible and discouraging when you are in the middle of it. But the story of Josephus is a reminder that invisible faithfulness is still faithfulness, and that showing up with what you have, even when you cannot see the whole design, is never wasted. There is a moment in the Gospel of John chapter 12 where Jesus says that unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Things that look like endings are sometimes beginnings. Things that look like losses are sometimes seeds. And things that look like traitors are sometimes, in the long grace of God's patience, something else entirely. Josephus fell into a kind of death when he emerged from that cave. His old life, his reputation, his place in the community of his people, all of it died, and he became someone else. That someone else, for all the moral complexity of what the transformation cost, bore fruit. He could never have grown as the proud young Jewish general who marched into Galilee, believing he could hold back Rome. The death made room for the writing. The falling made room for the witnessing. The loss made room for the preservation. I know that is not a comfortable thought. If you are in the middle of your own falling, if you are in the cave right now, surrounded and uncertain whether there is any way forward that does not feel like betrayal of who you were supposed to be, if you are living with the weight of a label that someone put on you and that you cannot seem to shake no matter how many years pass, what I want to say to you, gently and with great care, is this: God has not finished writing your story. The chapter that looks like the ending might be the chapter that makes everything after it possible, and the version of you that comes out the other side of this hard thing might be the one who does the thing that matters most. You cannot see the full picture yet. Neither could Josephus, neither could Moses, neither could Paul. But the one who holds history sees all of it, and he has not let go. That is not a promise that everything will feel okay soon, and I will not make you that promise because it would not be honest. But it is a truth grounded in the entire narrative of Scripture and confirmed, unexpectedly and powerfully, by the life of a first-century Jewish historian writing in a Roman villa with a broken heart and a pen that changed what we know about the world Jesus walked in. God moves through the complicated and the clean alike, through the chosen and the unchosen, through the famous and the forgotten, through the faithful and even, sometimes, through those who never quite made it all the way to faith, but who lived in its orbit closely enough to leave behind something that faith could use. Josephus lived in the orbit of the most important event in human history. He was born in Jerusalem, in the generation that followed the ministry of Jesus. He breathed the same air, walked the same streets, knew people who had known people, who had seen it all firsthand. And he spent his life writing about that world, preserving it, insisting that it be remembered, even as it burned. 2,000 years later, that insistence matters. His writing is cited in seminaries and apologetics courses, and late-night conversations between friends, trying to figure out if any of this is real. His name shows up in books, defending the historical Jesus, in lectures about first-century Judaism, in footnotes that connect the world of the New Testament to the wider world it actually lived in. And all of it came from a man whose own people called him a traitor. There is a kind of poetry in that, the kind that feels less like coincidence and more like something deliberate, something that has the fingerprints of a God who is not bound by the judgments of history, but who works through and beyond them toward purposes that take centuries to fully reveal themselves. And if that is true of Josephus, then there is every reason to believe it might be true of you as well. Your story is not finished. The chapter you are living in right now is not the final chapter. The label someone put on you is not the last word. The God of Josephus and Moses and David and Paul and Mary Magdalene and the thief on the cross is still writing, still moving, still finding ways to bring truth through broken, complicated, beautiful, human lives. That is the hope I want to leave you with. Not a soft, easy hope, but a deep, roots-in-the-ground kind of hope. The kind that has been tested by history. The kind that survived the destruction of Jerusalem and the death of the temple and the long, patient centuries of waiting for the morning. The kind that shows up in the writings of a man who was called a traitor, but who preserved, against all reasonable expectation, the memory of the world in which the Son of God walked among us. His name was Josephus, and his story is not really about him at all. It is about the one whose world he accidentally preserved, the one whose name has outlasted every empire and every accusation and every fire, the one who said, in the Gospel of John chapter 14, that he is the way, the truth, and the life. Truth. That word keeps coming back. Truth that survives. Truth that finds unexpected hands to carry it. Truth that refuses to stay buried. If this story moves something in you today, press the like button, leave a comment below, and subscribe to this channel. Every person who joins this community is someone else who might be sitting right now, wrestling with doubt, carrying a label someone gave them, wondering if their story is too broken to be useful. Help us carry the message that God is not finished, that the traitor might be the witness, that the fallen grain bears fruit. Subscribe, share, and help us keep spreading the story of Jesus.